Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham is the author of Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins' efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. She is a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University, and previously she taught at the Madeira School and American University. She has a PhD in history from American University, and in 2023, she was awarded the Cokie Roberts Fellowship from the National Archives Foundation and a Rubenstein Center Research Fellowship from the White House Historical Association. Her writing has been published in the Washington Post, Time, Slate, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. Rebecca will be joined in conversation with local professor Jenny Ziegler. Jenny V. Ziegler is Assistant Chair of English at the University of North Florida and completed her MFA in nonfiction at the University of Arizona. Her work has been published in the University of Texas's Bat City Review, New York University's The Washington Square Review, Bending Genres, Roanoke Review, Squawk Back, Mayday Magazine, The Normal School, Essie Daily, and the Appalachian Review, among other outlets. And she often focuses on history, the body, folklore, religion, science, and identity in her lyric essays. And currently, she is working on A Still Wilds, a collaborative collection of photography and essays that document the preserved areas of Northeast Florida. So Jenny, I leave the rest to you.
Thank you so much. And welcome, Dr. Brenner Graham, and all of you joining in to listen to our Lit Chat today. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We're so excited to discuss the impact of Dear Miss Perkins with you today. And with me, I've got my own copy right here. Absolutely lovely. Love reading through this. You can see all my notes already on this. I'm very excited to jump into this conversation. Dr. Brenner Graham, you wrote an expansive overview of Frances Perkins's life in the Labor Department and beyond. We get to know her dreams, her challenges, her impact. As the first female U.S. cabinet member, she is much more than, as you mentioned in your book, she's much more than a fun fact. We first meet Miss Perkins in the introduction. We enter the book on the night of November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, a night of devastation, terror, murder, and detainment of nearly 30,000 Jewish men in concentration camps. Seemingly half a world away awaits a woman in a tricorn hat working diligently in the Department of Labor, often the only woman in the room. Would you mind sharing for our listeners today an introduction of Miss Perkins, Madam Secretary, and how you decided, as the author, how to begin her story?
Thank you so much for reading my book and for asking me that question. It's so great to be here. I also wanted to open with a quick disclaimer that I do have laryngitis, and this is the only hour I'm talking today. And if for some reason my voice ends, there's this hot water to bring it back fast. Frances Perkins was born in Boston in 1880. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts in 1902, where she had an American economic history professor who would take students to the local mills to show them that poverty was not working people's fault for not working hard enough or something like that. Then she volunteered at the Hull House Settlement Home in Chicago while working as a teacher. Then she moved back to the East Coast to continue settlement house work full-time. So she was part of a broader women's social movement that focused on helping poor people, immigrants, single mothers, and anyone else who could not provide for themselves due to no fault of their own. And then she brought these ideas with her into Governor Al Smith's administration in the state of New York, where she was on the State Industrial Commission. And then Al Smith ran for president in 1928, and he lost. But Franklin D. Roosevelt became governor of New York and appointed Frances Perkins to be the first woman cabinet secretary for the state of New York as industrial commissioner. And then Franklin D. Roosevelt, arguably the most charismatic political figure of that era, became president of the United States in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression. And he brought Frances Perkins with him. And she brought those ideas about helping people in need and entrenching the government into the economy to serve working people into the Roosevelt administration. So that's how we meet Frances Perkins as the first female cabinet secretary. Women's groups, many of her networks had been petitioning him to have a woman cabinet secretary. but she was also a natural choice because of the career that she had already had up until that point. I like how you ended the question, Professor Ziegler, with why did I open at Kristallnacht? And I was a full-time high school history teacher for the full duration of writing this book. And in late 2023, when I was completing my manuscript, it was, excuse me, it was the anniversary of Kristallnacht in November 2023, like an anniversary that ended in 5. I think it must have been, I'm not great at math, 85 or something like that. And I was teaching 12th grade Holocaust studies at the time. And I opened class that day with, I think it was an NPR clip about Kristallnacht because of the historical anniversary. And then the topic that day was American responses to the rise of Nazi Germany and to the Holocaust. And that was how I noticed that Kristallnacht is an important opener. And that's because American interest in what was happening increased after they witnessed these headlines, and people had been involved in these efforts before 1938, as my book discusses, and also significantly after 1938. But because it's a moment of increasing attention to the atrocities overseas, and because Frances Perkins herself was following carefully and closely, that's why it was an entry point for the book to start.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. So in my first question, it's really about where we meet as readers, where we meet Frances Perkins and how you decided to sculpt that entrance into her narrative and really her larger story. Could you let us know how and when you met Frances Perkins and when you decided to pursue her life, her impacts as a project that turned into this book?
Frances Perkins graduated from Mount Holyoke College in 1902. I graduated from Mount Holyoke College in 2015. And in 2014, when I was looking for a senior thesis topic, I received an email that said paid American history internship in Washington, D.C. So I applied for it, I got it. And what it was that the Frances Perkins Center in Maine funded specifically a Mount Holyoke student to organize the research of biographer Kirsten Downey, author of The Woman Behind the New Deal, who at the time lived in the DC area in Old Town Alexandria, Virginia. So that was how I read The Woman Behind the New Deal. Kirsten Downey told me personally that the refugee policy chapter of Perkins's career was underexplored and that there were these incredible documents housed in the National Archives at College Park, also in the DC area, that could tell me more. So I worked on it for my senior thesis, and that was about a year-long project, as a senior thesis is. Then it made me fall in love with history. I went to graduate school, did a master's in public history and a PhD in history on different topic. I did postal history for my dissertation, but that doesn't matter for the purposes of this conversation. And then about a month after defending my dissertation in summer 2021, I realized that what I really wanted to be doing with my time and energy was returning to this topic. And I realized that kind of abruptly when I was at Barnes & Noble and flipping through a book that was very tangentially related to this topic. I'm like, oh my goodness, why am I looking at the index and footnotes in this book to think about a project that I haven't been responsible for in 6 years? And I realized it was what I wanted to throw my energy into next, and I had the privilege of doing that.
Great. Yeah. As soon as you start looking into those note sections, it's like, that particular project still has claws in you. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'd love to continue our discussion about your writing process. I truly appreciated that you outline in your acknowledgement section when and where you wrote various chapters. And I know in our audience, we have not just readers, but also writers and writers of nonfiction or people who are interested in perhaps pursuing nonfiction topics. So could you tell us a little bit about your writing project or process for this project? Did you write every day? How long did it take you to write an entire draft of the book? Did you work on certain chapters, certain threads? So we would love to hear a little bit more about that.
I'm a very social writer, and I'll just start at the beginning. So from my undergraduate thesis, I had 3 chapters. 2 of them were unusable. one was a little bit usable. So when I initially queried an agent in early 2022, after finishing graduate school in summer 2021, I revised the one that was a little bit usable. And that ended up getting revised a couple more times. And that's chapter 4, the charge bonds controversy. And then I rewrote what is now chapter 7, Dear Miss Perkins. It used to be called Visas, which is less compelling. That I actually in May 2022, I had COVID for a week and I didn't have to go to work because I couldn't give the students COVID. And so I wrote that chapter, but actually I ended up rewriting it again the following summer. It still wasn't really there. And then before going on submission to publishing companies that summer, I wrote chapter 1, Becoming Frances Perkins, because my agent told me that that we needed to know who she was in order for companies to consider, which completely makes sense. So then after I signed with a publisher in very late 2022, and I had a deadline in very late 2023. So I'm like, oh my goodness, I have a year to write this book. Sorry, I have to cough, so I'll mute for a second. So I started, I initially thought that after becoming Frances Perkins, it would be becoming Nazi Germany and then becoming American immigration law, but I ended up reversing those. But those 2 introductory chapters were the ones that I wrote next. Those are synthesis chapters drawing on mostly history books that already existed. So those were easier to write during the school year, because like I said, I was a high school history teacher. And I would write before school, I would write during my free block. I was the supervisor for Model UN, and before that started every day, I would sit in the comfy chair in the faculty lounge and be working on it. And like I said, I'm a very social writer, so I would chat with my colleagues as they came in and out to use the printer. Like my friend, the Latin teacher at high school, who has a lot of photocopies because Latin, he knows so much about my book because he used the copier a lot. And then over spring break, I did a research trip where I went to Columbia, where Frances Perkins's personal papers are, and then Mount Holyoke, which kept an extensive archive of her whole career. Like a proud grandmother is the energy that that repository has toward her. And so by the end of that school year, I think I was on to chapter 6 or chapter 7 out of 13. And then that summer, I wrote 7, 8, 9, and 10 over the course of 9 weeks. So then I didn't have to teach because it was summer and I was in the archives a lot. I had my 2 fellowships that summer. And I also got to travel. Like my little brother was interning. I have 2 much younger siblings. One was interning in LA. So I literally wrote on the beaches of Santa Monica. My little sister was interning in Cincinnati. And no offense to Cincinnati, but I ended up repeatedly walking over the bridge and working in Newport, Kentucky, which I just found more conducive to writing. And now I have an event there in June because it was a bookstore cafe that I would work on. And then by the end of that summer, I had 3 chapters left, 11, 12, and 13. I told myself that I would do 11 in September, and I did. I finished it on September 30th. Chapter 12 that October. And it took a little bit into November, and then I was approaching my deadline, that December 1st deadline. But I finished it in early November. And then because I worked at a boarding school, we had over a week off for Thanksgiving so that international students could visit their families. I wrote chapter 13 and the introduction and afterword in a little over a week in November. It was like a writing retreat. I mean, any writers on the call know the feeling of having all the demands of life. And then sometimes a deadline is a gift because it gives permission to put this first ahead of everything else. And that's how I wrote my book. And just to circle back once to the point that I'm a very social writer, I have a writing group with 3 other historians in it. I also, because this book was for a trade commercial press, not peer reviewed, I had historian friends review almost every chapter. And so there are a lot of people in my life reading every chapter as I wrote.
That's great. I love the network of support that you had, during this process. That's wonderful. We always, take a look at writing as such an solitary act, and really it's not, it's almost this communal act in many ways, you know, even if it's just sharing your progress with someone else. And of course, having people to look over drafts, so on and so forth. And I love discussing the writing process. We might have some follow-up questions for you later on that, on how it is a process, it's practice. And as you put it, you know, so nicely, of making time in your day, you know, to value that work. Absolutely, absolutely. So turning more so to content, let's dive into learning a little bit more about Frances Perkins. One of my favorite things to learn about Perkins was when FDR offered her the job of cabinet secretary, and she declined at first. And when FDR pursued her again, she actually drew up a wish list of legislation as part of, in my words, you know, a signing on negotiation. And I thought that was so fascinating. And, you know, she was interested in minimum wage and unemployment insurance and broad economic relief, really. So could you, this is a kind of a bit of a broader question, but could you speak a bit about her impact on the New Deal and legislation that still benefits our society today?
Frances Perkins did not seek out this position. She had a network of women contacts who were seeking out the position for her, but that was not at her orders or anything like that. She was reluctant to take it because her husband was ill and institutionalized, and her daughter was young and needed support and attention. And if she was going to do this, she came in with a list of policy proposals. And all of them passed except for affordable health care, which has become a more recent story in American history. Her ideas fed into key New Deal legislation that we know as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act. It established legal mechanisms for collective bargaining, strikes, and unions, which had been a long time coming in American history. Also in 1935, later that summer, the Social Security Act provided insurance to people who could not work to support themselves, whether they were old or had a disability or responsible for taking care of children. And mute so I can cough. Then the third landmark piece of New Deal legislation that she was directly involved in and very proud of was the Fair Labor Standards Act of summer 1938. And that's the one that established set work week hours, which have evolved since then, but that was the first time there was a federal standard, and also a minimum wage. An event that I did not mention earlier when I was introducing her is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in downtown Manhattan, now on the NYU campus, in March 1911. She was working across the street when it happened. She was out to tea with colleagues. She was working for the National Consumers League. She watched it happen. She witnessed people falling to their deaths. And it was on a Saturday, and they were Jewish women mostly, and it was their Sabbath. So workplace protections, and basically she witnessed an experience that if the federal government did not put limits in place on workplace safety and practices, the employers were not going to do that on their own. So the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was arguably the crowning achievement of her career, as well as those others too. And the story of her immigration policy is connected to those in a lot of ways. One is that prior to Frances Perkins's tenure as labor secretary, the Department of Labor was not spending its energy creating jobs. It was spending its energy deporting immigrants as a way of, in theory, creating jobs. But it was spending its resources rounding up people from their communities and forcing them to leave the country by any means necessary. And so she reformed that. And then also, as part of the backlash to the Wagner Act of 1935, the strikes and unions one, there was a communist immigrant an alleged communist immigrant who led it. And Congress didn't like him because alleged communist, and secured workplace protections among dock workers on the West Coast. And in 1939, they attempted to impeach her for it. They did not succeed at impeaching her for treason because she had not committed treason and there was no evidence of that. But that did have an effect on what she was able to do as labor secretary. And a couple of the possible pieces of refugee policy legislation happened after that resolution to impeach her, and she couldn't testify because at that point she was a political liability. So immigration was constantly connected to these as well. And the Immigration and Naturalization Service was in the Department of Labor from 1933 through 1940 when Roosevelt moved it, less than a year after the impeachment resolution, actually slightly over a year after the impeachment resolution. One other thing that I should mention is that she created the INS. Previously, the Immigration and Naturalization Bureaus were separate from each other because the Immigration Bureau focused on deporting people and the Naturalization Bureau just had much less work because it wasn't letting people stay. But she combined those and attempted to consolidate authority to reform the system and to streamline it to welcome immigrants.
So many of your points will have some follow-up questions about. And let's start with perhaps, you introduce really early on in the book that Frances Perkins had a deeds, not words mentality. And, as you mentioned, she was a witness as well as a participant in so much of history, of American history, of course, worldwide history as well. And as you mentioned, one very early event, in her life that seemingly kind of altered the course of her, I hate to say like ambition, but like her focus was witnessing the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. And you write on page 15 that Perkins grieved the what if and undertook the what now. And so my question to you would be, what can readers learn and therefore apply from her personal and professional journey about being an active and engaged citizen?
Frances Perkins was a workhorse, not a show horse. Biographer Kirsten Downey introduced that phrase to me, and I've heard her say it many times. It's true. I would argue that you need both. You need someone like Frances Perkins who doesn't want credit for anything for a variety of reasons, who's really nose to the grindstone, getting it done, compiling statistics, asking people who work for her to compile statistics, and then networking with the people who can make things happen. But you also need publicity sometimes. And she worked well with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was really good at public persona. Nothing in this story was a one-person job, and I think that that's a huge takeaway from it. She worked on child refugee policy with Jewish woman activist Cecilia Rozovsky, who personally canvassed homes to see in Jewish communities to see if refugee children could stay there and if the people would be willing to look after them. And both Rozovsky and Perkins knew philanthropists who were willing to fund immigrant journeys.
I'd love to speak to, in my reading, in my opinion, what felt to be the heart of this book. So much of Perkins' career, and really more than that, her conscience, her dreams, her life, revolved around making the American dream concrete in legislation. Truly, she lived by the sonnet that raised money for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Perkins took those words that rest on the pedestal as the belief of the foundation in many ways of and for American society. And briefly, I'll quote those some of those lines. "Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she, with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." It's estimated that 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. And during those years, so many applied for refuge on American soil. It was Perkins who lifted her lamp, who kept watch for worldwide refugees, but especially those fleeing Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, early 1940s. It was she who held the line and the door open and the lamp lit as best as she could. You write on page 279, yet she was not a superwoman saving people left and right. She was a professional whose innovative policies and solutions shaped real people's daily lives. Could you speak to her impact on immigration at that time and those, especially Jewish refugees, seeking asylum in safe shores during this time period?
I'm going to go all the way back to the 1880s to start answering this question. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act set precedents for excluding a group of people from immigrating because of where they were from. It banned Chinese laborers. In 1917, a new Immigration Act doubled down on that policy by expanding it to what it called the Asiatic zone and also barred people with disabilities. In 1924, the National Origins Act, or the Johnson-Reed Act, established quotas limiting how many people could come from each country. It was several thousands for Western Europe, and it was a few thousand for Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and then it was 100 for most of the countries in the world. I used to tell my high school students that's fewer people than are in this building right now. And Congress makes laws. The executive branch implements them. And Perkins was able to have a say in immigration policy through creative implementation. There was essentially a federally funded mob called Section 24 that would round up immigrant communities and deport them from the Department of Labor before her. And she let its funding run out and then laid them off. And she worked together with her Commissioner of Immigration, Daniel McCormick, who died tragically when his appendix exploded while in a meeting on Capitol Hill in 1937, and then got someone who was less qualified for the position through no fault of her own. But when she worked with Daniel McCormick, they had a great working relationship. And they would do things like construction projects on Ellis Island that would have rooms for social workers to prepare their materials. A small change like that makes the day more manageable for the social worker who's advocating for the immigrant. And through creative implementation, there's a great article about this by political scientist Neil Hernandez in the Journal of Policy History. It's called Against the Grain. I love that it's called Against the Grain, and he fact-checked a couple of my chapters for me. I love that it's called Against the Grain because she's an exception in this history of American immigration law. And I spend chapter 12 on the historical memory of immigration to the US, because when I was a kid growing up in the 1990s and my 6th grade class took a trip to the Statue of Liberty, they told us that this was a nation that had welcomed immigrants. And so I traced, like, how did we come to believe that when these acts were not welcoming of immigrants? And there is something parallel, to be honest, between Frances Perkins' journey of discovering the limits of American immigration law with my journey discovering this upon researching her. Because when I started this research project in college, I had read The Woman Behind the New Deal. I knew how successful she was with other programs. I thought that she was going to be saving people left and right. But sometimes she could intervene concretely and save a life, and she helped tens of thousands of people to immigrate. But there are so many cases where her hands were tied. The laws were in her way. And it's not just the laws, it's the xenophobic Americans who elected the people who made the laws. They didn't want refugees, and they didn't want refugees in large part because they were Jewish.
To one of your quotes popped into my head when you were recalling your own trip to the Statue of Liberty. That individual, I thought this was just a beautifully written line, and one to really be thoughtful about and to dig into. That individual memory, collective memory, and official memory each play a key role in how we understand the past. And for those of you who are going to, of course, get the ebook from Jacksonville Library, I know that the physical copy is still on order, but that is on page 207. I think that's a wonderful quote to sit and think about and to reflect on, but I just wanted to point to that beautiful line, Dr. Brenner Graham, that we have to treat those memories as distinct, and as we look to the past, to be very conscious of that as well. So, one really, I guess it's not ever a quick follow-up. I know I keep on wanting to dig into some of these things that you're mentioning here, some of the threads. But for our listeners today, do we have estimates or records on how many people Perkins assisted to America?
The number is tens of thousands. There were several hundred refugee children through a collaboration between the Children's Bureau, the INS, and the German Jewish Children's Aid Incorporated. That's the focus of Chapter 5. And then most of the numbers comes from visa extensions. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took her advice that she had been saying for years after Kristallnacht to extend the visitor visas of Jewish people from Nazi territory who were already in the US, that was an immediate 10 to 12,000 people. And also she engaged in the repeated extension of visitor visas throughout the time that the INS was under her oversight, especially after 1935, which in Germany would have been the Nuremberg laws, which made Jewish people non-citizens. And through those visa extensions, eventually Congress took notice, the predominantly anti-immigrant Congress. So the reason we have those numbers is actually because Congress asked the Department of Labor to compile them in the late 1930s. And I think, and I include that table in the end of Chapter 7. I suspect that the Labor Department kept the numbers as low as they could in good faith get away with, because Congress was looking to see the numbers be low. So altogether, tens of thousands is the estimate.
Yeah, great, thank you. Somewhat related to this, of course, and this is kind of blending, of course, our discussion of content, but also briefly turning back to the writing process. You titled the book Dear Miss Perkins. This was inspired by, the seemingly endless letters that she received during and after her tenure in the Department of Labor. Something that I highly appreciated as a reader of your work was to read portions of these letters, to witness the hope, the self-advocacy, and living testimony of these people who were applying to seek refuge. Was it hard to select or to decide which letters to include?
Yes, definitely. And that's why that chapter was rewritten multiple times. So chapter 7 was originally called Visas, and that's the one that delves into several individual examples. I really just picked them based on which were the ones that I was still thinking about when I came home from the archives that day. And the original title was The Efforts of Frances Perkins to Aid Refugees from Nazi Germany. Doesn't have the same ring to it. Very end of the senior thesis process, it became Dear Miss Perkins, after a particularly brutal meeting with my senior thesis advisor where he told me a bunch of things that didn't work. I was like in tears. I was 21, and that's usually how you think of your title, right? Like sort of in a dark moment of clarity. And then it stayed Dear Miss Perkins the whole time. And then even after I changed that, the title of Chapter 7 was Visas until the last time that I rewrote it in summer 2023, when it became Dear Miss Perkins. It's the chapter that corresponds to the title, so that seemed right. And those documents, it's usually a mutual contact between the refugee and Perkins. It's someone who Perkins knows from any stage of her life and career, who knows someone whose life is in danger, and she's writing to that. And they either hear, whoever was writing to her about it would explain the situation through those letters, and then she would correspond with them.
It was such a powerful chapter to read through, certainly. So speaking of, another powerful chapter that was included in this book. Most of us know the Von Trapps through The Sound of Music. You have an entire chapter on the Von Trapp family, which I can imagine to American readers, American audiences, to be a very interesting chapter. You outline the Von Trapp's kind of gravity to the American public. And could you speak to that to our listeners today, and the Von Trapp's enduring and complex place in American popular history?
During the 1930s, the Von Trapps were well known and well liked, but they were not nearly the cultural phenomenon that they became after The Sound of Music, which has very little historical reality in it, by the way. And in the 1930s, they had a mutual contact named Gertrude Ely, who lived and worked in Pennsylvania. She was a social performer. She knew the Von Trapps, and she connected the Baron Georg von Trapp to Frances Perkins when they needed their visitor visas extended a few times, including after the INS was in the Department of Labor, and Perkins actually sent a note to the Department of Justice after the INS moved in 1940. And when I started looking at the Dear Miss Perkins letters, when I was about to be a senior in college in 2014, biographer Kirsten Downey had told me, you're in the right papers when you see the Baron von Trapp's business card. That was how I knew I was in the right correspondence, because it was one of the many examples. And instead of just including it as one of the many stories in chapter 7, it becomes the focus of chapter 10, because it also helps to transition from when the INS was under her oversight to when it wasn't anymore. And it also transitions into the historical memory chapters, because I was not the only Jewish child growing up in the 1990s who thought that the Von Trapps were Jewish because the Nazis were chasing them. I mean, I was a kid. The Holocaust by that point was at the forefront of American collective consciousness. The Baron Georg von Trapp played the guitar in the movie. My rabbi played the guitar in real life. Everyone was running from the Nazis, so why wouldn't they be one of us? And it wasn't until I started researching them that my thesis advisor pointed out, they're not Jewish. I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, that seems important. And they were somebody that she was able to help.
I think we have time for one more quick question before we turn things over to our audience to ask some questions to you. So there's so many questions I still want to have follow-ups to, but I suppose maybe we'll end with this one before we transition into that question and answer. Given the current shifting political climate, how or where do you think Perkins' legacy can be seen most clearly today?
The necessity for working together. She was really good at taking policy ideas and implementing them into law, whether that was her collaboration with members of Congress in writing legislation, or I'm gonna cough 1 second. Or her creative implementation of the laws themselves. But you need more people than her. You need activists like Cecilia Rozovsky and philanthropists like the people from Hull House backing individual refugee cases, and all the people who did the work to sponsor refugees that we don't know about because they didn't want attention for it. You need all of those people. And so my book makes me think of the relationship between individual and collective action, and you need both. And also, on one hand, most people died, and that's horrible. And also there are individual cases where the right person in the right place was able to make a difference, and those are worth not forgetting.
Thank you so much. Well, we will turn things over to our audience. And as you can see in the chat, Susan is writing, we are going to open up to audience questions. So if you have any questions, whether it's about the content of the book, of course, even no question is too large or too small, of course, or even if it's about the writing process, we'd love to hear them.
I will jump in and say we did get one sent to us earlier, so I might read it out for you guys. So the question was, this book is meant to teach people about an unknown/unacknowledged part of history. What part, if any, did your future audience and the goal of them learning about this figure in history play into the writing process?
I see Frances Perkins as an ideal tour guide. Like, this is occasionally marketed as a biography, but it's not really a biography. She's a tour guide who happened to have all these important things happening around her. And like I said, I was teaching while I was writing the book. The history of American immigration law is something that you can understand the magnitude of by how she had to work with it when that became her job. She participated in Hull House. She witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and then she brought the ideas around that with her throughout her career. There are many important topics in the broader history of women's movements, in the history of American immigration law, and also in the broader story of American responses to the Holocaust that can be taught and understood by following this one figure and what's happening around her. And to answer these questions to the best of my ability, I'm going to quickly refill my hot water so I have a voice.
And again, as you're thinking about different questions to ask, again, whether it's about the breadth of the book, individual chapters, maybe follow-up questions to any of the discussions that we've been having today, or again, about the writing or even the reading process, that would be wonderful.
So we have some questions in the Q&A chat box if you want to open it up and go for it.
It looks like we have one question that asks, were there times where you had to separate facts and the determination of facts?
Facts and the determination of fact. Help me understand the word, how the word is determination is operating there.
Perhaps that there might have been some vulnerability in the interpretation of it. I'm guessing, and Eileen, please, excuse me, please correct us if we're misinterpreting your question. So were there ever perhaps moments in your research where you, I suppose, had to make a judgment call, perhaps?
Oh, I think I understand the question now. Thank you. In Frances Perkins's memoir, The Roosevelt I Knew, she writes about Franklin Roosevelt's career and his decision-making processes, but she was consistently a trusted advisor throughout his gubernatorial and presidential administrations. So a lot of times when she says, and he was thinking this, it's actually what she was thinking and what she advised him, whether that's Social Security or extending the visitors' visas after Kristallnacht. So that's an example of just because she says something, she might have had a motivation to downplay herself. And many historical actors that leave documents are like that.
Great. Our next question comes from Joan. Hi, Joan. I think I know Joan. Do you have plans? And she actually took one of my follow-up questions. So thank you, Joan. Do you have plans to write another book, either a continuation of any theme in your current book or on another topic?
I fell in love with being a historian through my senior thesis on this topic. And then I loved doing my dissertation. And then I wanted to have this experience of writing this book. And I hope to write history for my whole life. Right now, what I hope my next project will be is so there are definitely related themes, but it's a different chronology. I'm hoping to write on popular cultural representations of the American Revolution through a female millennial lens. And I'm teaching a class on that topic at Brown University in the fall. My syllabus is due February 18th. So I'm hoping that that will, light a fire to get going on my next project.
Amazing. We'd love to read it as a follow-up to this book. We have another question. Did Frances Perkins ever speak with FDR about the atrocities in the concentration camps to encourage the US to do something specifically about them before the end of the war?
Thank you for asking that question. So Frances Perkins's direct involvement on the refugee crisis largely ended in 1940 with the transfer of the INS. And what's known as the final solution did not begin until 1941. So She mentioned it in her memoir, The Roosevelt I Knew. Just mentioned in passing the atrocities because American audiences started becoming aware in the early 1940s. By that point, Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. So I have not seen evidence of them discussing what happened in the Holocaust specifically, but she definitely knew and followed it after her time as Secretary of Labor. But it's also important to distinguish that my book takes place during the rise of Nazi Germany and the rise of Nazism and the beginnings of American responses, but she was politically sidelined before what we know as the Holocaust unfolded.
Thank you. We have another question from Ariana, and I smiled a minute before because I read this as I was looking at the further questions, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this actually jumped off my first question, or this inspired my first question to you. So she writes, I knew of Frances Perkins only as mentioned in Dirty Dancing as the namesake of the main character, Frances Baby Houseman. Does Baby get a shout out in the book?
Okay, let's see. How many shout outs does Baby get? Definitely one at the beginning of chapter one, where it's a whole block quote. And I will pull that up because it's right in front of me. Chapter one opens. What's your real name, baby? Frances, after the first woman in the cabinet, she giggles. That's a real grown-up name. And then Dirty Dancing comes back in chapter 13, where I have a section title called I have a section title that's called Nobody Puts Baby in a Corner, but what about Frances Perkins? The 80s and 90s actually were not a time when people were talking about her a lot, and Dirty Dancing came out in 1987. I don't know if by any chance anyone in attendance went to Mount Holyoke College, but Frances Perkins is famous there because she's arguably the most famous alumna, and Dirty Dancing is also famous there because of the line, baby's going to Mount Holyoke in the fall. And first year students at Mount Holyoke, the women's college in Western Mass, open their first year by watching Dirty Dancing outside. It's called Movies Under the Stars. And then also conclude senior week over 4 years later by watching Dirty Dancing. And the two times that get big cheers from the crowd are Baby's Going to Mount Holyoke in the fall and Frances after the first woman in the cabinet. So I probably overuse those, and that's because they're important to me.
But I think that was such a great jumping off point for when you mentioned that she's much more than a fun fact, and what a great kind of structure to kind of enter her narrative through. I love that. So our next question comes to us from John, and he writes, can you compare the anti-immigration mood in the US during the 1930s with the current attack on all immigrants and attempt to deport them currently?
The policy priorities in the new administration have a lot in common with the 1920s when the Department of Labor, just got a cough for a second. When the Department of Labor was really under Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover before it was under Roosevelt, and that's when the focus was deportation. However, it's not a direct comparison because the executive branch has expanded significantly since the 1930s, 1940s. So after the INS was in the Department of Justice, well, now it's in the Department of Homeland Security. That's one of the biggest bureaucracies in human history. So what the executive branch has the power to do today, in some ways is unprecedented, but in terms of the ideas behind it, it aligns very closely with American immigration policy before Frances Perkins reformed it.
Thank you. So I suppose I have a follow-up question to one of our talking points when we started talking about Harry Bridges, and of course, the impeachment scandal, and certainly that being a pivotal moment in her career, where her in terms of her influence, kind of her star started to wane in terms of effectiveness and getting some of her policies through. So this is like a question a little bit more into like kind of wading into policy versus politics a little bit. Perkins was deeply invested in policy, very obviously, but did she think or work much on her public image, or was there a moment when public opinion seemed to shape her actions?
This question hits at the heart of the book, which is that Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet secretary. She was politicking constantly, whether it was what she wore, how often she spoke in meetings, how she talked to people, how she talked to people in writing versus on the phone. She was more candid on the phone. She was politicking constantly. So when people say that she didn't consider the politics of Harry Bridges, technically, yes, but also she was considering politics all the time. I call Frances Perkins righteous several times in the book, and what I mean by that is that she made decisions based on whether she thought they were right. She had an understanding of human rights before there was any legal framework for it nationally or internationally. There's no such thing as international human rights like there is today. And on the Bridges case, basically there was a resolution to impeach her for not deporting someone. And she could have made life easy for herself by deporting him, but there was no law that said you have to deport someone for being a communist. And she went into her immigration hearing and said that. I mean, sorry, her impeachment hearing and said that. And there was no Supreme Court decision that said you have to deport someone for being a communist. And so she reminded Congress about the balances of power and that she did not have rogue executive authority to do this, even if it would protect herself. She wanted Harry Bridges to have fair immigration proceedings, and the Department of Labor continued following up with him. They held him for a deposition in the late 1930s. So she could have done what was more politically savvy, but instead she stuck to righteousness while also politicking pretty hard beyond the scenes in order to be able to do as much as she did.
Great. Thank you. We have another question from Eileen. Any recommendations on how we can take a page from Frances Perkins to intervene in this presence of this return to the view of the 1920s?
She was very good at building relationships, often with people who knew more than she did. So identifying what people's talents and expertise are and bringing them together, like how she worked with Felix Frankfurter and federal judge Julian Mack and her solicitor of labor, Charlie Wyzanski, early in the administration on an issue of charge bonds. She was also very good at supporting her claims with research. She asked the president to hire Isidore Lubin to chair the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, which was new and also had an office in the White House. So two things that she was personally really good at were building relationships and also supporting her claims and actions with research. And then overall, I think I've already mentioned this, but just that not one person can do it all alone. And just because you can't do everything, it's still really, really, really important to do what you can do. And that people's actions together, in this case, did not save 6 million lives, but they saved tens of thousands, and that those matter.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we have one last question here from Janet. Was the INS still aligned with Frances Perkins' policies on immigration in the 1950s, or based on new laws passed in Congress after World War II?
The INS in the early 1930s was focused on reform, and I don't think it ever was, again, in American history after the early 1930s. Even in the late 1930s, after Daniel McCormick died and James Hofftelling became Commissioner of Immigration, it never had that righteous, almost idealistic bent to it. But in 1965, the Immigration Act that President Lyndon Johnson signed beneath the Statue of Liberty for symbolic intent, it abolished the quota system. And then American immigration became, it started to revolve around who has family here and who has jobs here. And so that did not perfect the system, but at least the law is currently not based on racist pseudoscience like it was after the 1924 Act.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brenner Graham, for talking with us today and for discussing your beautiful book, Dear Miss Perkins. And I'm sure all of our listeners are very excited to dive into this incredibly rich history and narrative that you've curated for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziegler, for asking such thoughtful questions. I appreciate any careful reading of my book like you've done. Thank you, Gabriella and the library, for having me. And thank you, everyone, for putting up with my voice, which in normal daily life, I do not have a raspy voice. This is not what my voice usually sounds like. So thank you for your patience.